Jim Carrey wrote himself a check for $10 million. At the time, it was completely worthless. He wasn't famous, he wasn't rich, he wasn't even close to becoming a Hollywood star. To almost everyone else, it looked ridiculous, a struggling comedian carrying around a check he couldn't cash. But here's what's fascinating. Years later, that exact number became reality. So, was it confidence, luck, manifestation? Or is the real story something much more surprising? Because the famous $10 million check is only half the story. The other half is what Jim Carrey was willing to do after he folded that piece of paper and slipped it into his wallet. Long before movie studios fought over him, Jim Carrey was just another young man trying to make people laugh. He grew up in Canada with a family that wasn't wealthy. His father, Passy Carrey, loved comedy himself and encouraged Jim's talent from a young age. But loving comedy and making a living from it were two very different things. When financial problems hit the family, life changed almost overnight. Jim has spoken about how his family lost their home and went through an extremely difficult period financially. At one point, members of the family worked as cleaners and security staff in a factory just to make ends meet. Imagine that for a second. During the day, you're helping clean a factory. At night, you're dreaming about becoming one of the biggest entertainers in the world. For most people, that dream would have slowly disappeared. For Jim, something different happened. The harder life became, the more he was convinced that comedy wasn't just something he enjoyed. It was his way out. As a teenager, he started performing stand-up comedy. Not in giant theaters, not on television, small clubs, crowds that didn't know his name, audiences that could turn against you in seconds. Stand-up comedy is brutal. If people laugh, you're a genius. If they don't, you feel every second of the silence. Jim experienced both. Some nights went well, others were painfully disappointing. He has talked about performances where jokes simply didn't land. Instead of giving up, he kept studying people. He watched how they reacted, how they moved, how they spoke, how tiny changes in timing could completely change a joke. Slowly, his impressions became sharper, his confidence grew, but confidence alone didn't pay the bills. He still wasn't the Hollywood success people imagine today. Years passed before things really began to change. Eventually, Jim moved to Los Angeles, hoping for bigger opportunities. That decision meant leaving behind familiarity and betting everything on a dream that still had no guarantees. Think about the pressure. No successful movies, no fortune, no certainty that anyone would ever know his name. Just a young comedian believing he had something special. That's where the famous check enters the story. According to Jim, sometime in the late 1980s, he drove into the Hollywood Hills after another difficult period in his career. He looked out over LA, the city where so many dreams begin and so many end. Then he did something that has become one of the most talked about moments of his life. He wrote himself a check, paid to the order of Jim Carrey, amount $10 million. And in the memo line, he wrote something deeply personal: for acting services rendered. Not because anyone had offered him $10 million. Nobody had. Not because he knew exactly when it would happen. He didn't. He even dated the check several years into the future. He then folded it, placed it inside his wallet, and carried it with him everywhere. Now here's the part most people misunderstand. People often hear this story and think the check changed Jim Carrey's life. It didn't. The paper had no power. The ink had no power. What mattered was what Jim Carrey did after putting that check in his wallet. Because while that piece of paper stayed hidden, Jim's work became relentless. That's where the real story begins. From that moment on, Jim Carrey treated every audition like it mattered. Because in his mind, it did. The check in his wallet wasn't a guarantee that he would become successful. It was a reminder of the person he was trying to become. While others saw another struggling actor, Jim kept showing up. He kept refining his performances, working on his impressions, and taking opportunities that many people would have considered too small to matter. Then slowly, the momentum began to shift. In 1990, he landed a spot on the sketch comedy show In Living Color. For the first time, millions of people were seeing what audiences in small comedy clubs had been missing. His characters were fearless. His facial expressions were unlike anyone else's. His physical comedy was impossible to ignore. Hollywood finally started paying attention, but television success didn't automatically make him a movie star. The real breakthrough came a few years later. In 1994, something extraordinary happened. Ace Ventura, Pet Detective, was released. Almost overnight, Jim Carrey became one of the most recognizable faces in comedy. Most actors dream of having one breakout role. Jim didn't stop at one. Just months later came The Mask, then Dumb and Dumber. 3 hugely successful comedy films in a single year. It was one of the most remarkable career explosions Hollywood had ever seen. Suddenly, the struggling comedian who had once carried an imaginary future in his wallet was no longer imagining anything. He was living it. And then came the moment that made the old check impossible to forget. Jim has said that around Thanksgiving in 1995, he received a check for acting worth $10 million. The number written on the check matched the number he had written to himself years earlier. That's why the story has become so famous. Not because a piece of paper magically created success, but because the goal he had once written down eventually became real after years of relentless work. It's an inspiring story, but it's also one that often gets oversimplified. People hear about the check. They rarely talk about the years of rejection that came before it. They remember the destination. They forget the distance. If Jim Carrey had stopped auditioning, if he had quit after difficult performances, if he had decided that the dream was too unrealistic, that check would have stayed exactly what it was, a piece of paper. Instead, it became a symbol of persistence. Looking back today, it's easy to connect the dots. But when Jim folded that check and placed it in his wallet, he had no way of knowing what would happen. He only knew what he was willing to work toward. That's what makes the story endure. Whether you believe in visualization or not, there's something undeniably powerful about committing yourself to a goal so completely that you carry it with you every single day. Not because success is guaranteed, but because it reminds you why you're willing to keep going. Years later, Jim Carrey would become one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, star in films that defined a generation, and inspire millions with his story. Yet perhaps, the most valuable part of the story isn't the $10 million. It's the years when there was no applause, no blockbuster movies, no fame, just a young comedian refusing to let his circumstances decide his future. Sometimes the most important promise you'll ever keep is the one you make to yourself before anyone else believes it's possible.